Welcome back to Skeram. I know it's been a while since I made a video, and I put my last one on private because I was told it revealed a little too much personal information, which definitely was not my intention. But there was something kind of cool that I wanted to show you guys, or at least that I think's kind of cool. It may not seem like much, I know, just a raid group going to Molten Core 9-10 months into the content, but it's actually our second raid group, and it's the first time Skeram Alliance has had a second raid group in, gosh, I don't know how long, since April at least. Not long after this, another guild also started to raid Molten Core, and the result was that over the month of June, our active raiding population more than doubled from 50 or 55 to over 120. And look, I know that may not seem like it's that impressive, but believe me, for a server like Skeram, that's nothing short of miraculous compared to where we were. And I really just wanted to make this video to bring you guys along on that journey and show you the joys and challenges of leveling and preparing for raiding and raiding on a server like Skeram. Back in May, when we first started to get a large influx of new players, I decided to roll an alt to experience the game along with them, the joys of leveling on Skeram. And obviously, me being an experienced Skeram player, I went with the druid because I'm totally dependent on stealth. But it ended up being a good choice, and as you can see here, I ended up doing a lot of tanking. This was my first time playing a tanking or a healing class, and I really enjoyed it. I know people complain a lot about SM boosts and CG boosts and ZF boosts, but on Skeram you really can't rely on that. Skeram Alliance, I mean, of course. Obviously, Horde have entire boosting discords where you can buy any sort of service imaginable, but we mostly just run dungeons the old-fashioned way. And for a brief period of May, when we had all these new players, Skeram Alliance was like the classic launch all over again, really. There was a large group of us leveling at the same time, doing the same quests, and running the same dungeons. I naturally fell into the tanking role, and it meant that I never had too much trouble finding any group. By the time I hit ZF, I felt like a tanking pro, I was AoE pulling masses of mobs without a care in the world, healers' mana be damned, and when we wiped it was their fault, of course. By the time I hit 60, I tanked a lot of dungeons and wiped a lot too. Healer issues every time, obviously. In fact, we wiped on the pole that I dinged 60, which was pretty funny. But I met a bunch of new people, many of whom joined my guild and raid with us to this day. Probably the coolest moment throughout my whole leveling experience was when we somehow managed to get a raid group of 9 or 10 people together to do the elite quests in the hinterlands, the ZF Mallet quests and all that. It wasn't planned, it wasn't an event. We all just happened to be in the area. It was a total fluke. I don't think there's ever been that many Alliance in the hinterlands. Period. We even had a Horde stumble by and help us out. It was really a perfect encapsulation of the best part of leveling as Skeram Alliance. These moments where you're running randomly and totally unexpectedly into these other players out in this hostile and unforgiving world and doing something you really didn't think was even possible. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but these quests literally are not possible normally on our server. There simply aren't enough people interested in doing them, and yet, I don't know, that day, for whatever reason, there were. For a brief time, Skeram Alliance was positively booming, at least by our lowly standards. There were 3,000 items on the auction house. 3,000! Normally we would have had like 400. We had over 20 people in Ironforge on random nights. More than 120 people online in our guild alone. Hell, at one point nearly a fifth of all low levels on the server were Alliance, which is just insane to think about, but this wouldn't last. Things couldn't last, and to explain that, I'll have to start by saying that I haven't given you the full story. I've painted a pleasant picture of leveling on Skeram, but to imply that this is representative would essentially be to lie to you. The truth is much darker, and I'd like to quote a post that an Alliance player made to give you a glimpse of what it was really like for these newcomers. Hey, new Alliance here. Blank, the Night Elf Hunter. Been leveling non-stop in a duo since we got here. While I get it's part of the game, please spread the word to stop corpse camping low levels. I don't understand this, even in a regular setting. You get nothing from doing this, but in this case you potentially hurt your own server. This is the stuff that made everyone leave in the first place. I'm not leaving, I'm making a list of names. But if I'm getting corpse camped, other people are too. These people may not have the resolve to stay if they're denied the ability to even play at all. And here's that same player a few days later, responding to Horde complaining about getting killed by an alliance once. I hope this is satirical. My man, the amount of times I've been ganked as alliance at level 40 plus is astronomical. We didn't do anything either, we just happened to be on their road. We've pretty much hung it up. We wanted to help balance the server a little bit by adding some fresh alliance, but instead we were beat into the dirt. And what our Night Elf friend here fails to understand, unfortunately, is that while these posts are precisely the reason that people grief, they do it to ruin your day. There's nothing more complicated or nuanced to it than that. We'll even upload YouTube videos bragging about it.
Swole Benji here. This is footage of me ganking over 60 lobies on Skeram. Yes. And what you just saw there was me humping a sapped girl gamer and then tasing her boyfriend. He watched as I had my way with her and then I killed her in front of him and there was nothing he could do to stop me.
This guy is a rather special case, obviously, we'll put it that way. And last I heard, he's not too popular with the Horde either. But he certainly wasn't the only one to spend hours and hours killing every leveler they could find. You know, we got constant reports in world chat, and it wouldn't matter how many times you went out and killed him. In fact, I don't know what it is, but they have like a sixth sense of knowing when when a higher level is about to come to stop them and leaving at the perfect time. I don't know. Anyways, but they keep coming back. In fact, they'd bring friends. They killed flight masters and they camped neutral towns. You know, here's a guild out on July 4th when the Booty Bay guards were deactivated, spending the day killing every lobby they saw. We'd come out to protect the lobies, but as you might imagine, it didn't go too well. Can only do so much, you know? In fact, if I'm being honest, we were only willing to do so much. Those of us who've been on the server long enough are rather cynical about the griefing and simply view it as part of the Skeram experience. Newer players, though, really had to see it for themselves to believe it. And some, like our Night Elf friend from that post earlier, they still couldn't believe it. When the guards presented a problem, people would just use safe spots to evade them. This is a tried and true tactic of theirs on Skeram. They do it now. They did it in Phase 2. And a GM even once came down and told them to stop, which was pretty cool, but they never did. Turns out it's actually pretty easy to break the rules when there aren't enough people on the other faction to trigger the auto-report function. Who would have thought? But you might ask, who's they? I keep saying they. I should be a little more specific because I'm not talking about all Horde generally, or even the vast majority. I'll explain in detail a bit more soon, but I wanted to mention that this is not everyone. Now, it didn't get any better for people as they approached max level. In fact, if anything, it got worse. Now these new players were worth honor. Minuscule honor, but honor nonetheless, and they were competing for resources, you know, and in one particularly comedic Discord exchange, a Horde raider farming for materials complained about being griefed by a leveling alliance who was stealing his mobs by trying to complete a quest. Such stories abound, and here you can see that even getting attuned for raids themselves presented difficulties, you know, and in this case, a raid group was repeatedly sheeping the BWL quartermaster mob to prevent my friend from getting attuned, which he didn't that day. By the time I hit 60, the more than 1,000 people who'd come to play on Skeram to experience it for themselves had been whittled down to less than 100. And like I said in an earlier video, all we're left with are the weirdos, the spurgs, the loners, the gold farmers, the Russian power levelers, the bots who accept auto invites, the Venezuelans who couldn't afford to transfer, the plain stupid idiots, and the post-apocalyptic role players who had a sheer stupidity of remain like me on this bizarre hellscape of a server. They dealt with a level of griefing that would drive most sensible people away, rightly so. And this wasn't like Phase 2 where there was at least some rationale for it. No, this was just purely malicious, and I think what got a lot of people was the inherent unfairness to it. A person might reasonably ask, what do you mean unfair? Of course it's unfair. You chose to roll on Skeram of all servers. What did you expect? You deserved it. You hear this a lot when it comes to world PvP. You kept rezzing, what did you expect? You fought back, what did you expect? PvP happened on a PvP server, what did you expect? You know, all this really is deflection. It removes the onus of responsibility from the person doing the killing to the person doing the dying. You know, you'll almost never see someone admit to griefing. It's always denial, to the point of denying the very concept itself. In one of my previous videos, I claimed that the Alliance on Skeram were the controlling factor in world PvP situations, basically because there were so few of us that we just had to leave and there'd be no more world PvP at all. You know, that changed when Skeram received its crop of idealistic new levelers back in May. In a sense, the server restarted, and the Horde once again had the agency to engage with the sort of lively, if still heavily imbalanced, factional environment that had existed on Skeram back in the fall. The vast majority refused to abuse their newfound agency, but some did. For those of us who've seen Skeram's entire lifespan, this was not particularly surprising, but for many newer players it was a surprise, and often an insurmountable one. In fact, I think these debates over fairness are at the heart of what might be termed the clash of cultures on Skeram. Now hear me out. This clash is central to the server's story and identity, and it's part of what makes this server so interesting, and it really revolves around these two competing conceptions of what world PvP is or should be. Here you see what's more or less a fair fight, I would say. They have the numbers, but we have a healer, and it could have gone either way. In fact, we went back and forth with these guys all night, winning some, losing more. These are the sorts of fights I enjoy and that I seek out. I consider them ideal. And for me and many others, this is what real world PvP is, quote unquote. Of course others feel differently. There's no such thing as a fair fight, you could say, so I might as well just camp and grief without remorse. The ends always justify the means. Might makes right. Neither conception is inherently wrong, but I think it's worth emphasizing that we all have a choice. In the end, we each decide how to engage with the World of Warcraft, which is, at its core, a social environment that both factions are a part of. We may not share a language, but we exist and we interact and we even communicate. We fight and we ignore and we befriend each other, sometimes in equal measure. Without this social aspect, WoW would be little more than a loot grinder. And it's why Blizzard's decision to deliberately exacerbate already existing faction imbalances to the point of destroying entire factions through free transfers was so perplexing and disappointing. But even on Skeram, this social environment remains vital. Most encounters on this server aren't epic world PvP moments or brutal griefing, but rather the vast, muddy, muddled middle ground in between. Recently I spent about a week farming raiding consumables at the Winterfall camp in Winterspring. This place is just about the best farming spot in the game, at least in my opinion, and as such it receives a lot of visitors. And as you might imagine, the vast majority of them are Horde. Now, in theory it should be impossible for me to farm here because these Horde would all gang up and kill me. It's a PvP server, red equals dead and all that, right? But in practice, a lot of factors influence how we deal with the other faction, and this leads to a variety of outcomes. As you can see here, upon entering the area, I walk up and greet every Horde in the camp. I deliberately make myself known so that there are no nasty surprises on either side, and I make sure to walk in a straightforward, confident, and non-secretive fashion. That's key. Now, if you start darting back and forth nervously and stealthing up to people, it's a good way to ensure that all encounters are going to be pretty violent. Now, if one waves, I wave back. If one stares at me, I stare back. And if one attacks, I fight back. But normally it doesn't come to that. You see, Skeram's Horde population can be divided into two distinct groups. There are the farmers, and there are the bandits. Farmers are peaceful folk, mostly interested in grinding loot to get more loot to grind loot. Some of them are bots, some of them sell their goods for real-world money, and some of them are just regular players. It really doesn't matter from my perspective. They come from all over the world, not only the United States, but Russia, Vietnam, and Indonesia too. Now, if you aren't hostile to them, they won't be hostile to you. Bandits, on the other hand, will do everything in their power to kill you and ruin your day. They may not attack right away, but that's only because they are waiting for an opportune moment. If they can camp, they will, and if they can't, they'll often call a group that can. These bandits, they cause ruin and devastation across the land, and are responsible for every one of the atrocities mentioned earlier in this video. Bandits regularly come to defile the Winterfall camps, to steal the farmers' firewater, and to cause trouble with any alliance they see. It's vitally important that you learn how to spot these bandits and to distinguish them from the humble farmers around them. They mark themselves in many ways through their character selection, their name choice, their armor, their guild tag, and really more than anything else, of course, their actions. If you spot a potential or a known bandit, you must be on your guard and ready to fight for your life. I can't say exactly what to look for, as it's gonna vary by server. An undead named Voldemort, for instance, will probably be a bandit, but there's no guarantee. And in the case of this Voldemort, he's actually, he's alright. We had a little bit of a scuffle, but nothing too serious. Personally, I find orcs to be the most prone to banditry, with orc rogues and warlocks almost always being the most vicious. I can't say why this is precisely, but I do have my theories. What I will say is the bigger the bandit, the better they are at pressing their stun resist button. This is a scientifically proven fact, and definitely not confirmation bias. There are some orcs who I swear to God they've never been stunned in their entire life, and they use that 100% confirmed stun resist to pursue their evil agendas, and they must be stopped at all costs. Of course, I'm being more than a bit hyperbolic here, and my tried and true distinctions are entirely subjective and might easily be turned around back on me, but that's the whole point. We each determine for ourselves how we interact with the world. You don't have to make these distinctions. You can attack anyone you come across. As I've said, that's your choice, but it's just that, a choice. You're not obligated to kill people. You're not forced to. The game developers did not make you do it. You chose to do that. And for the Alliance players on Skeram, your choices are nearly unlimited, and your interactions with the other faction are plentiful, obviously. To put it another way, the nuances and challenges of constant real-time engagement with thousands of opposing players requires you to make a seemingly endless array of decisions, constant decisions. But when the other faction is almost entirely absent, interactions become rare, and this in turn constrains your choices. Warped population dynamics basically narrow the line between killing, camping, and griefing, and force players to take either an entirely peaceful approach or risk participating in the destruction of their own server. And most Horde on Skeram chose peace, and frankly, if I were Horde, I would too. It's not an ideal choice, but then again, this is far from an ideal server. By the way, not all bandits are irredeemable in my eyes, far from it. My orc friend from before, for instance, who killed me earlier, I had a feeling he could be brought into the light with enough time and effort. He wasn't a part of any big bandit clan, and he didn't have a particularly high PvP ranking, which is usually a telling sign. I did my best to make peace with him, and for a while it didn't work. He kept attacking and attacking. He won some, I won some, but the farmers just stood by and watched, as they usually do. Without that big bandit clan, he had nobody to call in to camp me, and eventually we worked out an uneasy truce. So soon peace was restored to the land, and fire waters flowed freely for all. I use these encounters to highlight what you might call the multifaceted nature of the Alliance-Horde relationship on Skeram. It can't simply be defined as hostile, because the reality is that much of the time it isn't. Hell, many of our most valuable new members are Horde rerolls. But for those who experienced and continue to experience the malicious, widespread griefing of a relatively small group of Horde players who, by virtue of population dynamics, still outnumber us and abuse this fact, this nuanced relationship is hard to see, and many felt it wasn't worth their time to see it, which was probably a wise decision, all things considered. Playing Alliance on Skeram can be, and often is, a miserable experience, made worse by people whose main joy in this game is causing misery in others. I won't and I can't deny that fact. But I will tell you something. Our Ragtag Raid 2, made up of the absolute lunatics that stuck through the worst of the worst, undergeared and unprepared as they were, downed Ragnaros that first night we entered. This may not seem like much of an accomplishment, but for those that had just experienced exactly what Skeram has to offer and made it through to Molten Core, this was like clearing it for the first time. A few weeks later, with a few more pieces of gear, the same raid plunged right into BWL. After a grueling 6 hours, we finally killed Nefarian. It was a struggle, but then again, everything else they'd ever faced on this server was a struggle too. They were prepared for that. And a week later, we downed it in 2 hours. We didn't break any records, that's for sure, but inasmuch as it's possible to feel a sense of accomplishment in this buggy, broken, flawed mess of a masterpiece game, I felt accomplished. Not exactly sure what the future holds for this server, for my faction, for my guild, but as with everything else Skeram related, I've learned to expect the unexpected.